Hey everybody, welcome back to BK's Bullets. Today we're going to talk about Miss Marvel, the finale in the entire series. Hey everybody, welcome back to BK's Bullets. As always, I'm your host, Brent, and today we're talking about Miss Marvel, specifically episode 6, but we might talk about this series in general as we wrap up our review series, which is kind of a joke because I've only done 2. Now, you may recall that I watched episode 1 6 weeks ago and called Miss Marvel the next big thing. I was real excited. I was watching it outside on my patio. The man cave had been torn up. I was going through a lot of shit. Long story short, everything's back to normal. We're back on the channel. We're back in the man cave. And Miss Marvel is wrapped up. Now, I didn't do reviews weekly for this show because I was really like down and out after the high of episode 1, and then to see episode 2 kind of lose that feeling that I had. And I was like, man, I really don't want to talk bad about this show because I loved episode 1 so much. And I think clearly it was a thing of direction, the directors changing from episode 1 to 2, and budget. All their budget clearly went to episode 1, episode 5, and episode 6. So those middle episodes kind of lost their luster in terms of action or drama or special effects or directing style with fancy camera moves and motion control rigs, all this other stuff that episode 1 had. So I didn't really feel like it was fair to shit on the show after I really loved episode 1, and episode 2 just kind of left me feeling like meh, like it was more of a Hawkeye type episode for me. And you can go watch all my reviews on the Hawkeye show. I didn't enjoy it that much particularly. I thought it was kind of ho-hum throughout the entire thing. Episode 6 kind of brought back that feeling a little bit of episode 1, although they're doing so much in episode 6 that doesn't make sense or comes out of nowhere, that doesn't feel earned, that it loses a lot of the luster for me of what could have been a great episode. I really feel like this feels like a bait and switch almost. Episode 1 is I still stand by this, it's a fantastic hour or so of television, right? It's a really strong first episode. After that, the series kind of it jumps off a cliff, really, in terms of quality. Don't get me wrong, the acting is great, the characters are still fun to watch throughout the series. So I'm not bagging on Miss Marvel, Iman Vellani, the actress herself, or anybody in the surrounding cast. They're all pretty much the same throughout the entire show, which is pretty good. I think they're all pretty good. What I'm talking about is the story falls off a cliff. The pacing kind of falls off a cliff a little bit in terms of the quality of story and action scenes and all this other stuff that you come to expect with a Marvel show, right? That's where it really falters. And then we come back to episode 6 here in the finale, and it climbs this cliff again after a pretty strong episode 5. I really did think episode 5 was pretty strong. But just climbing this cliff again of, hey, now we're going to throw in, the same chalkboard effects that we had in episode 1, and we're going to have more special effects and an action scene, and we're just going to throw everything at the kitchen, with the kitchen sink at you in order for you to feel like this show was worth watching. Do I think this show is worth watching? Not entirely. I feel like you could watch episode 1, 5, and 6. Maybe just 1 and 6. But I feel like this reveal of Miss Marvel being a mutant, so to speak, whether that's real or not, if that's truly the introduction of mutants in the MCU, fine. I have no problem with that. It did feel a little cheap for them to throw in the X-Men cartoon theme song with the mixed in with the rest of the music when he said mutation. That was like a tagline that you're supposed to get excited about, but maybe if I'd experienced it, I was spoiled on it, throughout the day at work. Just being on social media, trying to watch the news or something, and then just or being on the front page of websites, spoiler after spoiler after spoiler. Like, Disney Plus has got to get this show under control. Not the show, but just their drop times fucking suck. 3 a.m. for East Coast? Fuck you, Disney Plus. I know it's like midnight for California where you're left over at, but to have the expectation that everybody's going to watch these shows when they premiere, when they drop, fuck off. Like, just make it drop on a Friday night or Wednesday night, 8 p.m. on, East Coast time, 5 p.m. West Coast time, like a normal freaking show, and I feel like that would be easier to handle. Because you can obviously program it in whenever you want. So that's a whole different thing. But it just led to this like spoiler thing of like, oh, you better watch it first thing when you wake up or whatever. And I just, as the day went on, I saw more and more things that spoiled the cameo at the end with Carol Danvers, which was kind of lame to begin with. And then, because it was nothing, it was just nothing. It was just a tag for the Marvels, her sequel. And then you had the X-Men thing, the not the music tag, but the mutation and all this other stuff kind of was spoiled at the end. So it had, all that stuff was like internet article and tweet generating things to get people to get it trending because it wasn't that great of a story to begin with. Instead of like talking about, hey, the clandestine are cool villains, or I really understand the clandestine struggle as an immigrant in the country, or something like that. Just since that all kind of fell flat and wrapped up with the last episode, it's like, well, what can we do to throw in an action scene in this episode and then get people talking about this show? So we're going to make her a mutant, and we're going to throw in this Miss Marvel tag at the end where Brie Larson's going to show up. So that'll get it trending, and then people will talk about the show again, which I think is the wrong way to go about this stuff. If you're going to make a great show, make a great show. Make sure the story's great. You obviously took the time to find the right actors. They're all pretty great. I can't say a bad thing about most of these characters. I mean, Kamran's kind of boring as is, but just in terms of, I mean, I'm not of this culture or group, so I can't speak on the representation quality of it, but it feels to me like just a white guy. These are people that I've never met before, on television anyway, and that are being portrayed in a normal way as opposed to, watching Homeland for 8 seasons where every guy with a big long beard is probably a terrorist, right? So it's a representation thing that, surprising, it took us 20 years to get to this point for the Muslim community, where I feel like that probably should have happened 10 years ago in 2010, right? But hey, it is what it is. I'm glad it's finally here. But these little tags felt really cheap because the clandestine story was really weak. So if you're going to, I really feel like maybe they felt like, hey, we want to make a family drama about a superhero coming out story, so to speak, because you had that moment at the beginning of this episode where she tells her family she has powers, and they're like, oh, we already knew, we don't freaking care. How cool is it? What does it feel like? Blah, 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 rather than like, oh, you're weird, stay away from us, that kind of thing. Which is what you want from your family. You want your family to be accepting if you come out to them. If you're, different than your family, certainly. But if you wanted to tell that story, then tell that story. Make that story really interesting. Throwing in the clandestine and doing nothing with them and having that lead to nowhere doesn't do anything. If you want to make Damage Control the villain, then make Damage Control the villain of the entire story and have it revolve and take place all in Jersey City. Yeah, I can understand the voyage to Pakistan in the last 2 episodes prior to this one were important for that character journey and finding your history and all this other stuff that you laid out, but I feel like it would have been just as fine if we'd stayed in Jersey City and experienced more of the Muslim culture there, gotten to know the imam at the mosque, or following Nakia and what she was battling with, rather than just the touch points you had in episode 3 and 4 of the show. So, all the stuff that got tweeted felt rather cheap when the show really was about this family. So to have the clandestine come in and say, hey, we really like you at the end of episode 2, and then suddenly be the bad guys for 3 episodes was just really cheap. It was like, we want to make this a family show about this family, but we need a villain because it's a Marvel show and every superhero's got to have a bad guy. Who can we choose from? We like Red Dagger. Let's find a way to have him in here. Oh, but he only takes place in Pakistan, maybe, so we got to find a way to get to Pakistan. So how do we do that? Well, let's pull the clandestine that are apparently pretty old from Chris Claremont's 90s X-Men run, or maybe, is it Chris Claremont? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's only Alan Davis. I got schooled on this on the last episode of the Comic Timing podcast, which I do with my buddy Ian Levenstein, now of Comic Geek Speak fame. And so I have no familiarity with clandestine or who they are, what they are, whatever. But to pull that in only to throw them away just feels like, hey, somebody had a contract that we had to use clandestine in a movie or a TV show, and so we're going to do it this way. Nothing felt organic. It all felt kind of forced. And I think that's where Miss Marvel falls apart at the very end, is that the first episode was so great, so organic, so much fun, so much style, and then you throw in all these things that feel forced or that don't end up not going anywhere, and then you have an episode 6 that's like, there is no villain. The villain is now damage control when we thought it was the clandestine last episode, even though that was all entirely wrapped up. It was just really, really weird and wacky. It was like bizarre. It's like you got rid of Thanos at the end of the first movie and then spent the entire second movie dealing with the aftermath of the snap kind of thing. Like, that's how bizarre it felt. So Miss Marvel, I want to compare it to Hawkeye, because I think Hawkeye was the other weakest show of the Marvel shows that I've seen so far, and I've seen them all. Moon Knight had more going for it because it had a cohesive story throughout the 6 episodes. Miss Marvel did have a story. It was cohesive, but the way they wrapped things up so quickly and introduced the villains and made them villainous so quickly just was really jarring. And it really is showing the limits of this 6-episode format. I mean, you can have people talk about Obi-Wan that was premiering at the same time. That also had its issues. So it just feels Miss Marvel feels very disjointed for what should be a great show, for a great character, for a great, to introduce people to a great group of people that they may not have known because of the last political climate of the last 20 years or so. I didn't talk about it much in the first episode because I was so high on the episode itself, but in high school, I had a group of Muslim girls I was friendly with, and I got to know them, and I really love them, and I really respect them. So if you're one of those, shout out to you girls from the IB class of UHS 2004. And I was in high school with them when 9/11 happened. And I went to one of their weddings, and that was one of the most fun times I've had to experience new food, new culture, for a friend of mine from high school who's now sadly no longer with us. But it's just a great culture and a great group of people that's heavily misunderstood. So to have that showcased for the first time in a positive way for mainstream American audiences is fantastic. But at the same time, to have it be in such a weird, disjointed show of a story that just is not going to grab the mainstream in the way that it deserves is really a sad part about this show. So if your main mission of the show was to highlight this culture, Muslim American, Pakistani, Iranian, whatever mix of that you want to show, that everybody's normal and they're not assholes and they're really nice people, then make that the show. Make it a full house of this Pakistani family in Jersey City plus superpowers. Make that the show. What they did was a disservice, I think, in my opinion, if that was their mission. If it wasn't, if it was a byproduct, fine. But I really don't believe that's the case because the people behind the show, G. Willow Wilson, Sana Amanat, have been working on Miss Marvel for a decade at least. And they're very passionate about the character and their mission and what they want to do with the character and bring her into the mainstream. And to just have the show just kind of halfway do it sucks. Ugh. So that's how I feel about the show. To talk about the Marvel stuff, the mutant stuff that everybody's talking about, you got to go back to when Miss Marvel premiered 10 years ago, right? In terms of the character, not the show. So when the character came out, at the time, Marvel Cinematic Universe and Marvel TV were two separate places. You remember we had Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which had some involvement with the Marvel Universe. You had a Nick Fury cameo at the end of season 1, and that was kind of it in terms of tie-ins with the MCU. Then you had the Netflix stuff start up with Daredevil shortly after that, and Fox had the mutant rights with X-Men in their own universe. We got X-Men Days of Future Past, Apocalypse, Dark Phoenix at the time. All that stuff is done now, and everything's been brought back home to the Marvel MCU, but there was a divide between Marvel Television and Marvel movies. Jeff Loeb, who wrote Batman Hush, Hulk, Batman Long Halloween, Dark Victory, pretty much a great writer in many respects, but also wrote Teen Wolf with Michael J. Fox back in the 80s. He's also a screenwriter. So he was leading Marvel Television, and at the time there was a disagreement because Ike Perlmutter, who was the CEO of Marvel at the time, I think this has been just after they acquired Disney. I think Ike Perlmutter's still in this role at Disney Marvel, right? He has a disagreement with Kevin Feige. They don't like each other, whatever. So Kevin Feige, at the same time, doesn't want to respect what Marvel Television was doing. And since the mutant rights were elsewhere, there was a mandate pretty much in the comics. And it's kind of a rumor thing and kind of accepted as true that at the time, the X-Men comics couldn't write like new characters because that would then give the rights to those characters to the Fox division as opposed to Disney. So they had to recycle a lot of villains, and that's why the X-Men comics at this time aren't that great. And they're just recycling old stories and old villains. Anyway, so because of all of that, and maybe that mandate, Marvel Comics division decided, and television, because they were kind of the same division, they were all under Ike Perlmutter. Meanwhile, MCU's building their, phase 2, phase 3 stuff. And they decided to make the Inhumans a thing, right? The Inhumans. If you remember that TV show, maybe don't remember it. You may have seen more recently Black Bolt, played by Anson Mount in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. He is the king of the Inhumans. And in an alternate world, they might have been cool characters. That might have been a cool show. But because it appeared on ABC and was just this weird version of the Inhumans after a long, 5-year period of Marvel Comics trying to make the Inhumans happen, it ultimately failed. But the Miss Marvel comic book started out with Miss Marvel as an Inhuman at the beginning of this Inhuman wave, I'll call it, where Marvel Comics was trying to make Inhumans the new mutants, right? You had Joe Madureira come on this book called Inhuman. You had, I don't know if it's Jason Aaron or Cullen Bunn, Kieran Gillen, a bunch of these big name writers trying to make Inhumans a thing in the Marvel Universe. It ultimately didn't work because people aren't that interested in Inhumans because they are not mutants, and mutants have been around forever. They have the bigger franchise with X-Men, Wolverine, Cyclops, all those characters you recognize. Whereas if I name off Black Bolt, Medusa, Gorgon, Crystal, you may have a passing familiarity with them if you're a comic book fan, but you're not going to know who they are in the mainstream anyway. So Miss Marvel comes out at this time where they're trying to make Inhumans a thing. They have the Terrigen Mist explode all over in New York City, I think in the Infinity event that Jonathan Hickman wrote, which is collected in, I think it's the Ultimate Collection Volume 3, right? And that's where the origin of Miss Marvel comes from, because that's what's going on with the comics at the time. So I believe that's maybe why she was an Inhuman in the comics at the time, because of the mandate. So if Marvel Cinematic Universe is trying to reclaim her, so to speak, even though there's not much to be reclaimed, and say, we're not doing Inhumans at all, we're only doing mutants, therefore we're going to call her a mutation at the end of episode 6. okay, that's fine. But I think that's where the confusion may come in. So if you pick up a Miss Marvel comic book after the show, which I do recommend you do, because I've read the first, I think, 10 issues or so of her first series, which are pretty good. They're written by G. Willow Wilson, got Adrian Alfona on art. He had done Runaways with Brian K. Vaughan before. That's where you've seen him before. They're pretty good. They're pretty interesting. But they have a lot to do with this Inhuman stuff, with the Terrigen Mist and all this stuff. Just wipe that away. They're kind of separate from... every comic is separate from a TV show, unless you're Hawkeye, of course, because that ripped off that comic for sure. But regardless, don't have the show be a barrier for you to pick up the comic. The comics have their own charm. They have their own story, and just embrace it as something new. But I think that's where this thing of, oh, she's supposed to be an Inhuman. Well, over here she's a mutant, and her powers are different. In the comics, she stretches. She embiggens, and she said that line in the show here at the very end, where there's no, like, crystal energy around her in the comic books. It's more like she's kind of similar to Mr. Fantastic, Reed Richards, in that she can stretch and embiggen herself, and that's kind of her power. Whereas in the show, it's different from that. She kind of learns that at the end, but it all has to do with her crystal Jinn power, we'll call it, as opposed to her like actually stretching her hand and fingers and feet the way she does in the comic book. So if you read the comics and you don't see the crystal powers and the energy blasts and all that stuff, or her jumping around on these floating energy platforms, that's why. So there's a lot of like internal company politics to do with Miss Marvel and her origin at the time, and now it's kind of fallen into the MCU, and it's just like, man, I don't know how to make sense of it all, because you have to explain it every time. If you're like, hey, you like Miss Marvel, go read the comic book. Well, and then by the way, this is happening and this is happening, and these guys didn't like each other, and therefore, she was an Inhuman, and then, oh, by the way, she really should be an X-Man, but she's not really an X-Man because all this was happening with the movie rights, and it's just too much stuff going on. So this may be a long and rambling review. I think ultimately you got to understand that MCU is trying to reclaim her as a mutant and introduce mutants in the next phase, possibly. We'll see. But at the same time, the show started off great, finished okay, but was just not consistent enough to be a fantastic standout MCU show. And the more we get of these MCU shows after pretty much Loki, even though I didn't like Loki that much, it just feels like they're not putting that much effort into them anymore. And I think that's the real bummer, because characters like Miss Marvel, actresses like Iman Vellani, and all the other supporting cast here who are wonderful, they deserve better. So there you have it. It's my long rambling thoughts on Miss Marvel episode 6 in the series as a whole. If you liked the show, if you loved it, let me know down below. What did you love specifically about it? Was it the clandestine? Was it the representation? Was it the journey to Karachi? I don't know. Let me know down below. Oh, by the way, how the hell did she get her costume so fast? Again, you got that trope of this Marvel show. Here's the costume at the end of the episode, at the end of the series. We gotta stop doing that. Let's move it up a little bit. Make it episode 3 now. Come on. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Let me know down below what you think, and we'll see you guys next time in the Funny Pages.